Sincerest greetings to you, realist of ones. If you would allow me a bit of your time, it would honor me to regale you with a story. A tale of courage, perseverance, victory. Long ago in the ancient times, 2020, while plague ran rampant and the masses had become enthralled with the spectacles of man versus beast.
I called for help twice, and not a fuck you, what do you need, or nothing.
A young hero, mid-30s is totally still young, shut up, embarked on a journey to fulfill his destiny of becoming one of the most revered names spoken across the vast shadow of the Empire's influence. He braved the terrifying origins of the lizard robot king.
A sweet baby race.
He brought to light the secrets of the man in black.
You're a liar.
Survived Ninja Khan's minefield of deceptions and fraud.
He was just vehement on making a name for himself at my expense, and it created a lot of pain for me.
Stood in the face of the evil forces of mental witchery, and endured the curse of grief along with a family destroyed.
Now, we all know Carrie's my favorite, then Kev, then David, then Mike. But the rankings can always change.
Yet, like a distant flicker of a flame in the blackness of the unknown, a whisper traveled of a fearsome warrior, one whose song of liberation would be possibly the most formidable challenge yet for our hero, but in its conquest would lie the glory of the crowd in the content Colosseum, and lead him ever closer to an even fainter whisper, one of his own liberation from the most hopeless of enemies, the 9-to-5 office job. Or in other words, we're finally doing the thing!
At last the gods remove cock from fucking ass!
After promises aplenty over the last year and a half or so of eventually covering it,
Yeah, they're on their way. They're still coming.
the time has finally come for blood and sand, to marvel at the gods of the arena, for the vengeance brought by the War of the Damned. That's right, it's time for Spartacus. The extremely popular Star series from the early 2010s depicts the events of the Third Servile War and the legend of the Thracian gladiator who led the slave revolt that would not only bring a panicked frenzy to their Roman oppressors, but also serve as a symbol of the fight for liberation all the way into our time. It's also one of my personal favorite shows during this time period, and to be honest, just like apparently every other male my age, I love everything about and just really want a reason to talk about the Romans. And given that we're apparently going to be getting a spin-off series called House of Ashur here in the near future, that seems like as good a reason as any. So let the summer of blood begin, and let's do this thing. This is the real story behind Spartacus. And should you endeavor to see the House of Real Storius rise in prestige, then do the things to the buttons. Its cost is of nothing to you, but of the utmost importance to yours truly. And if you should see fit to bless us with coin, then head over to the Patreon to make your patronage official, and in return, I shall add you to the list of titans that you see before you.
You are an honorable man, and will forever bear my gratitude.
So one of the first challenges that I encountered when I began the research for this topic is that the ancient sources who spoke of it are somewhat scarce and had no first-hand account of the events. The information on it comes from the works of 3 historians who each spoke of the conflict in one of their writings, Florus, Appian, and the most notable of them, Plutarch. However, it's important to note that all of them lived at least a generation after what happened, with Plutarch being the closest time-wise to the events, but even still being born 115 years after the conflict ended. All 3 of their accounts, though, are essentially their own preferred version of details that were compiled from previous works by the historians Sallust and Livy, neither of whose complete accounts survived into our modern times. It's essentially like me trying to retell the events of a slave revolt during Civil War times, but the internet doesn't exist yet, and my only sources I have available to me are 2 super old books I checked out from the library. It'd be hard telling what conclusions I may draw.
Nice whip. This here is a pistol. Reach for the sky, honky.
That being said, I tried to do my best with what at times was very little factual information present to compare what is depicted versus the real events. However, my initial fear was that I wouldn't be able to come up with much to add to the topic, but to their credit, Starz did a nice job crafting a narrative that intertwines smaller, incomplete pieces of the tale with other more well-known facets of Rome's history and culture, teeing me up to add all sorts of nice extra content. I also read The Spartacus War by historian Barry Strauss, whose research was helpful on that front, and I'd highly recommend it if you want to keep going after this. So my overall hope is that by the end of this, you not only know what was fact versus fiction, but also that you leave here with a much clearer understanding of many of the subtleties and things going on in the background that are helping to propel the story, including the reasoning behind the inclusions of some characters that are fictional in nature, but have a clear purpose in helping to illustrate what life was like at the time for both Romans and their slaves. Given everything that I just mentioned, would it surprise you to find out that very little is known about the man called Spartacus prior to leading the famous slave uprising in 73 BC? But as a bold strategy, let's first begin with what we do know.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Most scholars place his birth sometime in the time period between 111 and 103 BC, which would put him somewhere in his 30s when history formally introduces us to him. We also know him to be a Thracian, a fact which the show reminds us of roughly every couple of minutes.
This sad, battered Thracian.
What do you expect from a Thracian?
Fight, you Thracian bitch.
The Thracian yet lives.
We're paying too much for the Thracian.
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 However, simply calling him a Thracian would be too simple a description, you see, which I will show you as we take a quick detour down the first of our context rabbit holes. Who were the Thracians? The land that was once known as Thrace was a vast region that encompassed parts of present-day Bulgaria, Turkey, and Greece. However, at one time its people extended into Romania and even possibly Serbia. It was also a massively populated area which tallied together would have been second in size at the time only to the Indians, and to which Greek historian Herodotus says, if they were under one ruler or united, they would, in my judgment, be invincible and the strongest nation on earth. But Thrace was in no way, shape, or form a united nation. Rather, it was divided up like a puzzle amongst a great number of different tribes. Each of these tribes had their own way of doing things and ferociously defended their identity and honor, leading to a great number of conflicts and bloodshed amongst them. But all that fighting each other developed the one thing that seems to be the major shared common trait. The Thracians were big, strong, fearsome warriors that in a straight-up 1v1 fight would have been a very tough matchup, which is what ultimately made them successful as gladiators, but we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Now, while they were great individual fighters, they were, like most everyone, ultimately no match for the Roman war machine, and in 168 BC, much of Thrace lost its independence at the conclusion of the Third Macedonian War, and the tribes along the coastlines and the plains began submitting to Roman command and serving in their auxiliary forces, or auxilia as it was called, which literally translates to the help. Most of Rome's cavalry were outside forces, and Thracians were known to be excellent cavalrymen, and so it is likely that Spartacus was also in this unit, possibly as an officer. He was also thought to be of the Madai tribe, which inhabited the Rhodope Mountains near the border of Greece and Bulgaria, on the southwest fringes of Thrace. Now, the general consensus seems to be that the further into the mountains you go, the more warlike and savage the tribes were thought to be. However, Spartacus himself is described by the sources as most intelligent and cultured, and even as being more Greek than Thracian. So the Madai might have been seen by the Romans as like a last bastion of what they deemed civilization before they get into the mountains. So given what we know about that and the time frame, it's easy to see how Spartacus comes to serve in the Roman auxiliary, which is where we first meet him properly in the show, when the Romans approach his tribe to form an alliance. At the time, Rome was in the beginning stages of their third conflict with Mithridates VI of Pontus, and while they had been embroiled in 2 prior wars with him, this was the largest of them by far, as the entire east of the Mediterranean and large parts of Asia became entangled in it through various alliances, feeling probably similar to a world war in ancient times. I'm not going to go into all the little details of this, but for context, just know that the Third Mithridatic War is being fought all throughout the entirety of the timeline of the show, and was still being waged for several years beyond it. This was a huge deal. In the show, the Romans state that in the chaos of the war being waged, that thousands of members of a barbarian tribe to the north, known as the Getae, are preparing to attack the Thracians, and so it is proposed that they join together to eliminate this threat. Who were the Getae? The Getae are likely originally related to and were kind of thought to be outskirt Thracian tribes that migrated north of the Danube River to the border of Thrace and the region above it, Dacia. Over time, they then became more influenced by Dacian and even Scythian culture, whereas most of Thrace became Hellenized by Greek culture. All of this to say they probably didn't look like whatever the hell these guys are going for, as Herodotus called the Getae during his lifetime the noblest as well as the most just of all the Thracian tribes. In real life, the Romans would not march against the Getae until 72 BC, about a year after Spartacus's uprising had already started, and was done because it was understood that the Getae were aligned with Mithridates, and it was decided to strike out at any of his northern allies. Instead, during this time period, it is recorded that the Romans were still dealing with the Dardani tribe a bit further south, and it would make sense for Spartacus to be in that general area. But I understand the small change to make the narrative flow nicer, and it would make sense for them to tell the Thracians whatever they needed in order for them to get them to come along without much of a fuss. Anyway, this is also the first time we meet the character of Gaius Claudius Glabba, who was an actual person, but whose presence at this point in the story is really just a plot device, as it is very likely he and Spartacus had never met prior to the revolt breaking out. But the writers do a nice job of cleverly adding a deep personal rivalry between them as a backstory to connect the dots on some of the things that we do know, such as the fact that we don't know for sure how exactly Spartacus ended up a slave of the Romans after having served in their auxiliary. Some posit that he deserted, and some say that he led raiding parties, but the show does a nice job of incorporating the deserter explanation within the storyline under the context of Glabba breaking their agreement to pursue a glory quest against Mithridates, thus leaving Spartacus's tribe defenseless against a wave of oncoming Getae invaders. The truth is, we know even less about Glabba than we do Spartacus, as his place in history seems completely tied to the latter's uprising, but I'll point out the things that we do know for sure, as well as the other purposes he serves in the show when we circle back to him a little bit later on. So back to Spartacus. After he and his fellow tribesmen get into a brouhaha with the Romans and bail, he gets back just in the nick of time to save his wife from getting diddied by a bunch of gritties.
Gonna fuck your shit, gonna fuck your shit, gonna fuck your shit. Gonna knock your bitch, gonna bang your bitch, gonna knock your bitch up. Gonna flip that switch, gonna scratch that itch, gonna fuck your bitch.
In the show, her name is Sura, but her real name was never indicated in any of the sources. However, what the show does accurately depict is that she was a prophetess, also from the Medai tribe, and she likely held some esteem and authority, seeing as the Thracians were ultra-religious and placed a great deal of importance in prophecy. According to Plutarch, she was also subject to visitations of a Dionysiac frenzy. What does that mean? Well, for one, it means that, like almost all Thracians, she worshipped Dionysus, who is the god of winemaking, orchards, and fruit, vegetation, fertility, festivity, insanity, ritual madness, religious ecstasy, and theater. Or in other words,
I am the god of chits and wine.
Fun fact, in addition to the Apollo Creed-esque laundry list of other things he was the god of, Dionysus was also the god of liberation, and so he was the chosen rallying symbol for many a rebellion and enemy of Rome over the years, which connects a nice little circle with Spartacus's whole thing. I digress though. Another thing it meant is that Sura likely was a handler of snakes, seeing as that is the god's symbol, and so her visions in the show of seeing her husband with a snake coiled around his face would make sense. In fact, as the legend actually goes, it was when Spartacus was first brought to Rome to be sold that his wife saw this not in a vision but in real life as her husband slept, and she declared it the sign of great and formidable power, which would attend him to a fortunate issue. Or I guess you could say,
you are destined for great and unfortunate things.
In fact, some posit that it was his wife's insistence of the whole snake thing being a sign of the gods choosing him to take up this cause of liberation that inspired Spartacus to lead a revolt in the first place, but there is no concrete evidence of that, and we are getting way ahead of ourselves because we need to discuss another big deviation that the show makes from the actual events for plot purposes. In the first episode, after Spartacus and Sura have escaped the Getae, they go on their run but are quickly nabbed up by Glabba and his men and are sold separately into slavery. Spartacus is condemned to die as gladiatorial sacrifice in a big spectacle by Glabba, but miraculously survives, leading to his being purchased by Quintus Lentulus Batiatus, who is a lanista, or an owner or trainer of gladiators. Getting his wife back then becomes the primary objective for our hero and the driving force behind ultimately accepting his new reality as a gladiator. In reality though, Spartacus and his woman were sold together to the same owner, and she lived with him throughout the entire time as slaves and escaped with him during his uprising.
The whole time you would... The whole time!
As far as the show purposes, she is essentially split into the characters of Sura and then later Mira. So it should go without saying, Batiatus did not orchestrate her death like we see in the show, and this was another change to advance the story by providing Spartacus a motive for wanting to rise up in vengeance against his master and lead a rebellion. I understand why the writers did this, as it makes for a sexier and purer story, and the truth is we can only speculate what the real motives and reasons for the uprising were, which, don't worry, we will, but we can say for sure that this didn't happen. If a personal grudge with his master is the reason they wanted to go with for the reason Spartacus chose to lead a rebellion, well, they evidently didn't need to take too many liberties with the character according to history. Plutarch refers to him as Lentulus Batiatus, but it has come to be accepted in the educational community that this is a corrupted version of what his name likely actually was, Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Vatia. For the sense of ease, I'm just going to refer to him as Batiatus, but it'll make sense soon why that fact changes things just a bit. In the show, he is brilliantly performed by the great John Hannah, who had a tall task to have me not immediately only see Jonathan from The Mummy. Then I realized he basically kinda still is, just if the character was dropped into Rome.
So then I killed the mummy and all his minions and stole his scepter.
Oh, you're so brave.
He is portrayed as cunning and ruthlessly ambitious, but you still catch yourself at times rooting for him due to his placement as being perennially looked down upon by those he wishes to be like, such as when he unsuccessfully initially attempts to earn Glaber's patronage or gain the magistrate's endorsement to help him enter the political world. And the way he is treated is pretty on par for how a Lanista would have been during those times by the ruling class. As far as social standing, a Lanista would have been equal to how we perceive a pimp in today's world, in that they peddle human flesh for a served purpose in exchange for money.
I'm telling you were a pimp. No! Are you even listening to the story?
And so the whole idea was shopping your wares around in hopes that someone was putting together gladiatorial games for a personal celebration or festival, or an editor, as they were called, would choose you to fill their order. You could make lots of money doing this, but as far as the elites were concerned, dealing with you was simply a necessary cost of doing business, and you were absolutely not one of them.
It's terrible, it's weird, it's awkward, they kind of think they're your friend, but they're not your friend.
Gaining status and position enough for one to call themselves a member of the small club of Rome shot callers was something that most men of the time aspired to, and there was no better way to set upon this path than through the political theater and gaining entry into the Senate.
Under such a title, we will climb beyond our station, beyond Capua. Perhaps to the very steps of the Senate itself.
By the end of Season 1, we see his counterpart in the show announce candidacy for the role of Aedile, but if in fact Batiatus was really Vatia as believed, then it is likely he was the same man that served in the political office of Quaestor in 75 BC, 2 years before the revolt broke out. I know those titles will likely not mean much to most of you right now, and we are going to circle back to this topic much more in depth later when we come back to Glaber, but for now what you need to know essentially is that means he was already a member of the Senate, as the role of Quaestor came with a lifetime admission and was the way most Romans began their political climb. This meant that while he was still technically a plebeian, or a member of the class of commoners not born to one of the establishment patrician families, he was not just a simple Lanista and had more political sway than his TV counterpart. If you want to use the pimp analogy again, he was not looked down upon as like a regular street pimp might be, but rather his status would be better likened to that of a high-end escort plug for Washington, D.C. In fact, many of the upper class would retain gladiators as bodyguards during times of public unruliness. Now that you have some of the proper context in order, let's talk about the real reason that people even come to watch this show.
Ass, titties, ass and titties. Ass, titties, titties, ass and titties. Big booty bitches.
Sorry, no, not that. Let's get into Spartacus's time in the arena. Throughout different civilizations that have existed across history, one human trait that has seemingly weaved its way somehow into most all of them, and all the way even into our current timeline: people love a good fight. For the Romans, the gladiatorial games were the height of entertainment. They served as spectacle, celebration, and oftentimes distraction from both personal and public issues. The first officially recognized Roman ones were in 264 BC to honor Decimus Junius Brutus, but the origins of the games have their roots in Etruscan culture, where they were thought to be a religious rite of sacrifice due to the spirits of the dead needing offerings of blood. Most of the actual religious connotations did not last long, and the Romans' adopted version soon evolved into grandiose events attended sometimes by tens of thousands of bloodthirsty spectators. These contests ranged from battles of men known as bestiari fighting wild and exotic animals, to religious martyrs being left to be mauled by said animals, to executions of those dubbed the enemies of Rome, to reenactments of classic battles, even eventually some naval ones where they would literally flood the arena in shallow water and use special flat-bottom boats. But unquestionably, the star attraction was the one-on-one battles. Romans delighted in debating over their favorite types of fighters and preferred strategies, and so this would have been a very popular topic of conversation. We don't know a tremendous amount about Spartacus's official career as a gladiator, such as like his win-loss record or anything, but we can say a few things as to how it's presented in the show, such as how he came to be owned by Batiatus. In the show, he is condemned to die by Glaba in the arena in a big spectacle, but is able to survive, miraculously killing 4 men and winning over the crowd, thus being purchased by Batiatus as a ploy for his other plots. Now, it is accurately shown that prisoners of war would be given sub-sufficient weapons and armor when they were sent in to fight for their lives, and the crowd's reaction to seeing 4 gladiators sent in to kill a single condemned man is also accurate, as the Romans would have looked down on anything other than a 1v1 contest. In reality, it's more likely that Spartacus was purchased at a slave market in Rome, like we see in other scenes, and caught the eye of Batiatus as he coveted big Thracians and Gauls for his stable, and was then brought on foot to Capua to the ludus. It's mentioned many times during Season 1 that Spartacus was not in fact our hero's real name, and this is true. The name itself is Latin for Spartacus, which translates roughly to famous for his spear. We still to this day do not know for sure what his real name was, but his use of the name Spartacus was likely similarly given to him in the same manner in the show, where Batiatus bestows the moniker on him, saying,
"The way he fights, like the legend of the Thracian king of old." Spartacus, he was called.
The man he is referring to, Spartacus I, lived a little over 350 years prior to our guy, and was legend for having overthrown the previous ruling family of the Bosporan kingdom and taking it for himself, establishing the Spartacid dynasty, which as a fun coincidence lasted all the way until 108 BC, which was right around the time that our Spartacus would have been born. Also, as a fun little full circle moment, when the Spartacid dynasty ended, the person who picked up the mantle in the Bosporan kingdom, Mithridates VI of Pontus. I just thought that was kind of neat. In any event, in the show, our hero is then brought to the ludus to begin his training, and this is where we meet the rest of the boys. While Batiatus personally did have a preference for his stock of gladiators, a lanista also had to be careful as far as the number of slaves from one tribe or ethnicity that they had, as this could also present an issue. Keeping them at odds was another practice done to protect against this, and so seeing a mix of them thrown together as they are in the show would have been accurate. We do meet a nice, interesting cast of characters, but the major 2 to focus on for now are Crixus and Enemaeus. As with many of the characters in Season 1 that actually existed, their storylines are mostly for plot advancement of the show, and historically they play more into the story once the rebellion is underway. Enemaeus is placed in the role of the Doctore of the ludus, and if the lanista was a pimp, then the Doctore was his bottom bitch, as it was his job to keep the other gladiators in line and instruct as needed to produce better fighters. In real life, Enemaeus was not a Numidian, but instead a Gaul just like Crixus, hailing from the lands of present-day France. However, if a small change in the details is what it took to get Peter Mensa on board, I'm okay with that, as he does a fantastic job.
The sentiment is well received.
Crixus is placed in the role of current undefeated champion of Capua and Spartacus's main rival during the first season. Now, one major thing that stands out as far as their rivalry is that, at least at first, these two would not have been paired to fight, and the reason for this is due to their styles of fighting. What were the styles of fighting? Like I mentioned earlier, the Romans were mad about the intricacies of these games, and they placed a special importance on the matchmaking of styles. They preferred matches pitting opposing styles, such as a style based on strength versus one based on speed, or one where endurance is tested against agility, believing that the clashing produced better and more action-packed fights. That being said, in real life, Spartacus and Crixus both fought as a heavyweight Murmillo, whose style centers around being a big, burly, beefy boy, and the pairing of the two against one another would just not have been something that people wanted to see. The Murmillo is one of the more common depictions in popular media when it comes to gladiators, and they would have been armed with a gladius, the standard sword of the Roman legionnaire, along with a shield called a scutum, an arm guard for their sword arm called a mania, and a large ornate helmet. They also would have fought barefoot and bare-chested, leaving all the more room to show off the scars of previous battles and any tribal marks, which is another detail that isn't that huge of a non-inclusion, but would have added some nice historical accuracy to the show in that Spartacus and his wife both likely had many tattoos. See, this was commonplace in Thracian and many other ancient cultures, as they were seen as marks of pride, contrary to where the Romans viewed them as marks of shame and punishment, like the gladiator we see with Fugitivus on his forehead. Just a bit of a missed opportunity, in my opinion, to draw a narrative line there. Anyway, the heavily armored Murmillo would have been paired normally with a style known as a Thraex, or Thracian, who fought with the traditional curved blade known as the Sica, and a smaller shield to increase movement and speed. In the earlier part of the show, Spartacus does fight in this style, but a gladiator fighting in a style based on their home culture was forbidden, national pride and all, and so this was not something that would have come to pass either. Interesting to note that according to ancient graffiti, it would appear that men fighting in the Thraex style would have been most popular amongst the women, while Myrmilones were most popular among the men, just adding to that natural rivalry. Later in the show, Spartacus switches to the Dymachieri fighting style, which carried two swords and little armor other than some arm and leg guards. Now, while this is a popular style in the show, being the one used by Spartacus, Animeus, Theocles, and Gannicus, we'll come back to him, historically, this was not popular amongst the Romans. Others are the Hoplomachus, who was modeled after the Greek and Carthaginian fighting styles and whose main weapon was the spear. Barca is the major one that we meet in the show, but being that he is from Carthage, again, he would not be fighting in this style. Nor would it suit his height, as the Hoplomachus was usually a role for shorter guys, and Barca likely would have been a Thraex. Another is the Retiaris, whose weapons were the net and trident modeled after fishermen, and this would have been a fairly new style at the time and likely looked down upon as a lesser form of gladiator. Their main opponent would have been the Secutor, whose style was designed to counter the Retiaris, but they would not have been a thing for another 75 years or so. The show does take some liberties with how the games would have unfolded for entertainment purposes, and I understand why they did, but I want to outline some of those real quick so you get a better feel for how these would have looked in real life. For one thing, most gladiators only fought a handful of times per year, and for the most part, outside of special occasions, gladiators would primarily fight opponents from the same school, so in the show, there is certainly too much interludus battling than in real life. This created an environment where you could be sharing a meal with the person that you're going to kill in battle the next day and plan his funeral on the following one. The combatants would mostly be matched against opposition of equal experience and skill, and matches were typically about 10 to 15 minutes in length, but did not have a time limit and could go as long as needed. In the average contest, when a gladiator wounded another to the point they could not continue, and that man did not surrender, they would actually be expected to back off and not finish their opponent off, as it was not up to them. It would be up to the editor of the games. And as we see in most recreations, the choice was usually put up to the crowd to decide if the fighter had put on a good enough show that they wanted to see him live, and the traditional thumbs up, thumbs down, or police versa, would be given, but it was backwards for what you would normally assume the meaning to be, and a thumbs up actually meant send them to meet Sky Daddy. The show explains a lot of this away, however, by declaring most of the fights conducted with no quarter given, and so it's not really a big thing to me. It does open up a discussion, though, about the concept of the pits that we see in the show, or an underground and more brutal version of the games where there were no rules or quarter given. Now, to be clear, there were matches advertised as no quarter given throughout the day, and there would also be gimmicks like blindfolded fights that were a thing, but there is no recorded evidence of such a place existing, such as what is depicted. But that would sort of be the point, wouldn't it? It is certainly not out of the question that given the nature of hiring gladiators and paying for their services that a private event couldn't be arranged for a wealthy patron who wanted to see some extra depraved shit, and it's not like the fighters could say no if they were commanded to do so. When a gladiator took an oath to a lanista, it was a sacred pact to be burned, flogged, beaten, or killed if so ordered.
You can't have a conscience in the pimp game.
However, so long as they cooperated with fighting as they were told to do, this likely would have been a rare occurrence, as they would have been treated more like a champion racehorse, given baths, massages, expert medical care, sexual company, and extra food, including barley porridge with an emphasis on adding layers of fat to add protection for vital organs. A gladiator was a considerable investment and typically required many months to a couple years of intense training before being ready to face another person in a battle to the death. See, because as a lanista, you could make a fortune, as we mentioned before, but it was critical to get a financial return on your investments before they stopped breathing, otherwise you might find yourself destitute very quickly.
I am never going to financially recover from this.
Reaching the primus, or the main event of a card, would take several years at least, and in a life where most didn't survive to see double-digit fights, you can imagine there were only a select number who achieved this feat, but the ones who did were rewarded immensely. For a gladiator, victory in the arena to the roar of the crowd was the highest of honors, as it not only meant you got to live to see another day, it could also mean riches, perks, and fame. It could also afford one the chance at the most important thing of all, something not all slaves could aspire to, a potential chance at freedom. Outside of some instances where a financially desperate or just plain bored aristocrat would enter the arena in search of riches or glory, the vast majority of gladiators were criminals or slaves. The ways one could find themselves enslaved in the ancient world were many, and the fear of falling into one was a constant boogeyman for the people of the day. The majority of slaves were prisoners of war acquired through conquest of other civilizations. However, there was also the means of piracy and kidnapping. Slaves could be born into servitude, as any child born to an enslaved woman automatically became property of the dominus. Further still, abandoned and neglected children of the poor were often enticed by slave traffickers and then whisked away. But it wasn't just neglected children that could find themselves slaves. The show touches on this a bit in the prequel series, but the Romans practiced the right of patria potestas, which basically granted rights to the father of the family, or the paterfamilias, to sell off his dependents as he saw fit. So I guess next time you ever think you're being too harsh as a parent, or that your parents are on your case too much, remind yourself of that. And last but not least, we have those that were citizens but fell into debt slavery, such as the character of Varro. Originally this was called nexum, and while it was formally abolished some 250 years before Spartacus' time, this was still something that could happen for a long time after. Varro himself willingly surrenders to be a gladiator as a means to pay off his gambling debts, and so this explains how he came to be there. The word can be roughly translated to mean not one's own, and so that can clue us into how the Romans viewed anyone who fell into this, and they were treated just as any other slave would be. This was due to the way the Romans viewed the concept of slavery. In America, at least, the idea of slavery obviously harkens up the enslavement of specifically black people kidnapped and brought over from Africa. The intent was always to create a permanent underclass that had little ability to gain freedom so that white plantation and business owners could have free labor. Slavery in Roman times was a little bit different. First of all, race played no part in this, as that wasn't really a thing at this time. Roman slaves were not viewed as inferior people, so to speak. They were people that lost the protection of the law, and so they were no longer recognized as people by the state. You were basically a piece of furniture that could speak.
Because you're not a real person.
Not real?
We're going to come back to this here in a bit, but the Roman slaves at the very least had a light to look to at the end of the tunnel. But in America, the state governments deliberately made it near impossible for an African American slave to attain freedom. As far as the treatment of slaves, it really depended on the person and their skills. Those with a trade or skill of some sort would generally have it a little bit easier, such as Greeks being accountants and tutors of the rich, and while being slave in name, they served more as a household administrative role. There were also slaves that held positions, such as a person's body slave or the doctoria veludis, that became almost like family. Those without that luxury, though, suffered incredibly, with the very worst being saved for field hands and mine workers who were literally worked to death, and also those who were sold into sexual enslavement.
Grab me with oil.
I'd rather not, if you don't mind. I'm not one of the oil rubbers, I'm just a guard.
Rub me with oil or die.
Where the Roman slave was theoretically at least at a disadvantage was in the fact that it was perfectly legal to kill your slaves in their culture, and while America had some laws put in place against that eventually, they were rarely actually enforced, so it's sort of a moot point, but you can be sure physical beatings occurred regularly.
Woof! You don't fucking talk to me like that! You little piece of shit!
In Rome, there was also a massive industry for capturing fugitive slaves that had run away, so you had far less chance of escaping. Some still took the risk though, as we already know. And that brings us to the motives for what propelled Spartacus to ignite rebellion and take such a risk. Well, as we just went over, the treatment of some slaves would have surely been enough to light the fire, and according to record, Batiatus was an especially cruel master to his slaves that he owned. However, we also know gladiators were a special class of slave and would have been cared for better than the average one, so this seems less likely to have been the sole culprit. Many have speculated Spartacus was Thracian royalty of some kind, and so servitude of any sort would just not do. The ancient sources also state that there was some nobles amongst the insurgents, and knowing that Spartacus was a cultured and intelligent person, this seems plausible as an underlying motivator, but it's not something we can say for sure. It's kind of like saying that Mr. Beast legitimately looks like he could be related to Chuck E. Cheese in some fashion. It's an educated guess, however, we can't verify it, and so all we can do is speculate. The most likely reason, in my opinion, though, was that at the time the revolt broke out, there were only a few months before the annual Roman Great Games as part of the Ludi Romani religious festival that began on September 5th. Batiatus's men were likely being trained for this, and with all of Rome gathering for the event, including the most powerful, there was sure to be a great deal of bloodshed ordered as the elite curried favor with the masses. This meant many of them were likely not coming back from those games, and so it was time to make a move.
Nobody makes me bleed my own blood.
This isn't to say these guys were afraid to fight to the death, as Thracians, Celts, and Germans were pretty hungry for battle, and probably felt about war the same way young Arnold Schwarzenegger felt about the pump.
I'm like getting the feeling of coming in the gym, I'm getting the feeling of coming at home, I'm getting the feeling of coming backstage when I pump up, when I pose out in front of 5,000 people, I get the same feeling. So I'm coming day and night. I mean, it's terrific, right? So, I'm in heaven.
But dying for Roman sport was not the same thing, I would imagine, to the great majority of them. Whatever the cause, those underneath the roof of Batiatus had made their decision, and they were ready to purchase their freedom with bloodshed. Before we get into the escape itself, I want to touch on a couple more fun little tidbits that got slipped into Season 1. One of them being the Real Housewives of Capua.
You must spend coins to receive coins.
Oh, that little whore! How positively depraved!
Perhaps you should buy several next time until you get the hang of it.
I could use a cup of wine to wet the tongue.
History tells us nothing of either Batiatus's or Glauber's wives, and so the characters of Lucretia and Ilithyia are creations of the show. They're both great characters played very well by their respective performers, but outside of some things to discuss with Ilithyia later, I don't really have much to say about them as it pertains to the real events. Something I did find interesting, though, is that the character of Licenia, you know the one, well, I was certain she would turn out to be another invention of the show, with a nice little wink to those who are in the know about her being a cousin of Marcus Crassus and what role he will eventually come to play in the tale. However, as it turns out, Marcus Crassus did in fact have a cousin named Licenia, but that's where the similarities to the show end, because in real life what happened to her was very different. Who was Licenia? The actual person was a priestess of Vesta, the virgin goddess of Rome's sacred hearth and flame, and as such she was known as a Vestal Virgin. As there were only 6 of them at most at any given time, this was a very unique position that a girl would be chosen for as a child, and came with a vast number of rights and privileges, some of which were not granted to any other Roman, as well as a generous retirement pension at the end. It also carried a number of responsibilities, however, such as a minimum service length of 30 years, which they were expected to maintain their virginity throughout the entire duration of. As well as other rituals, they would have been expected to tend to the sacred flame of Vesta, the eternal burning fire kept going inside of Rome, as a symbol of the life force and soul of the city itself. These oaths were taken very seriously, and a breach of them was also. For instance, allowing the fire to go out was viewed as though the Vestal had withdrawn her protection from the city and was a major neglect of duty subject to a beating or a whipping. Losing one's chastity was the ultimate sin, however, though punishable by the Vestal being buried alive, and if their sexual partner was found, they would be beaten to death.
Boo, you whore.
I tell you all of this because the real Licinia entered into the priestess role in 85 BC and was still serving during the time Spartacus's revolt broke out. However, 24 years into her term, in the year 61 BC, she was accused of having broken her celibacy in an incestuous relationship with her cousin Marcus Crassus after the two of them were caught closeted alone together.
You know, if anyone's gonna fuck my cousin, it's gonna be me out of respect.
Many believe that Crassus coveted his cousin's villa in the city and wished to get it on the cheap, so he set about this plot of framing her to have her removed from the role of Vestal Virgin, and when we get more into Crassus in part 2, you will see that is extremely in character for him and likely true. Anyway, in the end, Licinia was formally prosecuted but was able to beat the charges and left the Vestal role that same year, disappearing to history. And Crassus ultimately did get the villa.
Why don't you go back to your home on Whore Island?
That whole thing about aristocratic women wanting to bang a gladiator, though, is 100% true, as there are cases of affairs and even elopement. So the House of Batiatus offering that service makes a lot of sense historically. Another thing that makes sense is the drought, which is a major plot point of early Season 1 episodes. In the show, Spartacus slays Theocles, the Shadow of Death, at the same time that the sky finally gives way to a downpouring of rain, and in doing so, earns the title the Bringer of Rain. Well, when I dug into it, I couldn't find evidence of a drought at this time period, but starting in 75 BC, 2 years prior to the rebellion, it did mark a time of especially wet and rainy climate, noticeable by the flooding of the Tiber rivers in Rome. I don't know if the writers were doing their homework or if they just got it lucky with a wild guess, but I thought it neat either way. Something else I find kind of interesting to keep in mind while watching this is the relationship between the city of Rome and its favorite sister. Just over 140 years before the events of the show, the city of Capua had gone over to Hannibal during the Second Punic War. For those unfamiliar, this was Rome's greatest enemy ever known up to this point, who brought the Republic to its knees, waging a brutal 14-year campaign throughout Italy and handing the Roman war machine its most significant losses ever dealt. Due to this, when it was absorbed back into the fold, it had its nuts cut politically, and there was a bit of tension still in the air from this whole ordeal. While Rome might have had the biggest and most famous arena with the Flavian Amphitheater, or the Colosseum as it's better known, the unquestioned capital of gladiatorial combat was the region known as Campania, and more specifically, the city of Capua that lied within it that serves as our primary setting. The reason for this is because Rome did not want to have any sort of permanent large gladiator presence in the city for obvious reasons, and so that distinction went to Capua, with many eludists calling this region home, and so specifically, its high concentration of gladiators in one area would prove to be a major game changer and reason for the success of the rebels in recruiting large numbers so quickly. It was also the major supplier of medicine, perfumes, metalworks, and meat to the capital. It also had an incredibly large number of slaves comparative to other cities, with some estimating that as much as upwards of 30% of the population were enslaved, meaning that in hindsight, it was sort of the perfect breeding ground for a rebellion to have the things needed for success. Speaking of that, let's move on to the escape itself. In the show, Spartacus is successful in recruiting some to his cause, but is unable to sway any of the Gauls unless Crixus signs off on it as well. This was likely true as the Gauls, or Celts as they were known more broadly, were very much like Thracians in that position was of utmost importance, and they simply were not going to follow anyone not of their kind, no matter how sympathetic to the cause they might have been or how much respect they may have had for that person. This is where Crixus and Enemeus in real life would have been elected to essentially speak for their tribe and serve in a leadership role alongside Spartacus. Then in the show, we see an absolute bloodbath commence with the gladiators massacring many of Rome's elites who had gathered to watch Spartacus and Crixus fight to the death. Batiatus is among those killed, having his throat satisfyingly sliced by our main character, finally avenging the murder of his wife before he and the rest of the gladiators break out of the ludus, achieving freedom. In real life, though, things went a bit differently. Initially, Spartacus had recruited most of the house's slaves on board, and they were waiting for the right time to strike when they could have access to the weaponry needed to pull off their plans. However, no one can say for sure who or how, but someone sold out the group and informed Batiatus of their intentions, and the plan was nearly shot before it started. However, the group acted quickly enough that they stormed the kitchen and acquired utensils such as cleavers and skewers, and began fighting their way out of the house. But of the 200 that made the attempt, only 74 made it out. One massive change from what we see in the show, though, is that the real Batiatus was not killed during the breakout. What actually happened is that he likely was not even there when it happened, and furthermore, there's a possibility that he was such a hands-off owner of the ludus that he and Spartacus never even officially met.
Common slaves who try to kill me, try to fuck me like a whore, but I will not be fucked.
Anyway, in the immediate aftermath of the breakout, the gladiators were able to intercept wagons filled with gladiatorial weapons that were headed for another city and were able to upgrade their weaponry to proper arms. According to sources, Spartacus wielded the curved Sika of his people, and this is likely where he would have gotten it as he was denied the weapon in his gladiatorial career. Next, the group would have begun their travel to Mount Vesuvius, which is about 20 miles south of Capua, just out of visibility from the city. This made sense as there were woods around it flush with game, and nearby farms that would have been not well tended, providing plenty of food and drink. Thracians also were mountain people, and so Spartacus would have likely felt right at home in such an environment. It also provided a very good vantage point in all directions so that they could see anyone approaching to give them trouble, which was about to pay dividends. Not long after they made it to Vesuvius, they would be set upon by an armed group likely funded by Batiatus to bring his runaway slaves to heel. Instead, however, the gladiators repelled this group and stole their weapons, further providing them with better equipment to continue the fight, and now some of them even had armor. It was right around this time that some of the field hands from those aforementioned nearby farms began running away and showing up to join the cause, soon swelling their ranks into several thousand. This was going to become a problem for Rome, something they would need to deal with sooner rather than later. But they didn't really quite grasp just how big of a problem this potentially was. That brings us basically to the end of Season 1, and in between this and Season 2, they gave us an excellent 6-episode prequel series called Gods of the Arena that provides us some wonderful backstory info for many of the characters like Batiatus, Enemeus, and Crixus. It also introduces us to the character of Gannicus, who was a gladiator for the House of Batiatus, and plays a key role in helping to establish it, thus earning his freedom in the end after winning the primus of the first games of the great new amphitheater in Capua. Gannicus was a real character, but we don't know any of his backstory except that he was also a Celt/Gaul and was one of the lieutenants of the insurgency. However, the writers cleverly use him as a plot device to show us how a gladiator was able to sometimes achieve the feat of gaining freedom. Doing this, he receives the wooden sword known as the rudis that any freed slave would have been required to keep close by as proof of their freedom. Now, there are tales of famous gladiators indeed gaining their freedom, either through continuous winnings, such as the legendary Syrian Flamma, who was awarded the rudis 4 times but refused it every time, opting to continue fighting.
Because I'm a fighter. That's the way I'm made, Adrian.
Or through the course of fighting a battle for the ages, such as what happened between the gladiators known as Priscus and Verus, who are said to have been the very first ever match in the Colosseum. Legend has it these two waged war for hours, with neither gaining the better of the other, and both finally tossing down their arms in exhaustion and respect for the other. The crowd went so wild that they were both able to leave side by side as freed men. As a freed man, one would have had their citizenship entirely restored by their manumission, with the only exception being that they were not allowed to hold political office. Any children born of a freed person, though, would have had no restrictions or stigma, able to carry on just like any other citizen. Something I thought that was interesting is that slaves who had gained their freedom often added their previous owner's name on as part of their own to signify they were no longer someone's property, which was usually noticeable by someone having only one name. This being the case, and with Batiatus being as egocentric as he likely would have insisted, Gannicus likely would have been henceforth known as Quintus Lentulus Gannicus. The prequel series is great if you've never taken the time to watch it, but the reason for its existence is very unfortunate and sad, as it was necessitated after the cancer diagnosis of Andy Whitfield. In March of 2010, 2 months after Season 1 debuted, its leading man was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He initially completed treatment and was deemed cancer-free in June, so they began production on Season 2. However, a few months later, during a checkup, it was discovered that it had unfortunately come back, and this led to him voluntarily giving up the role so the show could go on. Andy Whitfield would pass away about a year later on September 11th, 2011, giving that day an extra shit mark on it. He died at the age of 39, ironically, likely at the same age the character he is remembered for died in real life as well. His replacement, Liam McIntyre, does a commendable job, and it's no knock on him, but Andy's presence is sorely missed and his absence is felt. As a survivor of lymphoma myself, I feel as a bit of a kindred spirit, and so I could think of no better way to wrap up part 1 than by formally acknowledging the man himself.
It doesn't matter if we are successful or not. It's about the journey.
I've got one hair left on my chin.
And if you commit to it, something extraordinary will come of it.
In my heart, I am convinced that this is all meant to be. It's supposed to be right here, right now. And I'm open to the journey and to the discoveries and to the adventure of all of this. Be here now is all about being present and not fearing what you don't know.
So Season 2 essentially covers the insurgents' path as they make their way to Mount Vesuvius, and the Romans' initial attempts to bring them to justice. This is where we begin to get more of the actual concrete details as well regarding the timeline of events as the Third Servile War officially kicks off. In the show, we learn that in the weeks following the escape from the House of Batiatus, that the rogue group of gladiators have begun terrorizing Capua. If you remember from part 1, we covered how in the immediate aftermath the rebels seized wagons on the road that were filled with weapons and also repelled a group of mercenaries sent by Batiatus to hunt them down. However, in the show we are instead introduced to the character of Seppius, who is fictional, but we're told is a young noble that has hired men to bring Spartacus's rebellion to an end, and who they only sorta, kinda, mildly hint that he's definitely fucking his twin sister Seppia. Now, while there are some notable instances of this, as a general rule, the I word was taboo in Rome and would have been looked at in pretty much the same way we do today, as evidenced by the fact that it was a sometimes used political attack to spread gossip about one's enemies that they had a fondness for one of their own. Remember back to the whole Crassus Licinnia thing we talked about earlier.
Right. When in Rome.
However, Seppius' fielding of mercenaries to essentially police the countryside and hunt down Spartacus would have been in line with what rich nobles did after the man who started the precedent, Sulla. We would be here way too long for me to tell you everything about him, as he was one of the most influential figures in Roman history, but let me quickly try and give you the abridged version of the OG Roman who marched on Rome. Who was Sulla? Much like today's American two-party system, the Roman politics of the late Republic were dominated by two main factions, the Optimates and the Populares. And also, much like today, these two factions would fiercely battle one another over the issues of the day. The main leaders of these two camps at the time would be two rivals known as Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, and these two had major history going way back. You see, Sulla had previously served under Marius's command in two major conflicts, the Jugurthan War and the Cimbrian War. and had proved to be very capable at this, being instrumental to Rome's victory. However, Marius was one of the most preeminent politicians of the time and was feeling overshadowed, so he began to take credit for Sulla's accomplishments while at the same time using his sway to try to limit as many opportunities as possible for his upstart rival.
So don't tax my gig so hardcore, Cruster.
Sulla's successes would prove to be undeniable, though, and he would climb to the top of the Roman political world just in time for the First Mithridatic War to kick off, which he was given command of. However, through some crafty trickery and alliance building, Marius was able to essentially steal Sulla's command out from under him. Here shortly it will make sense as to what a monumental deal this was. Sulla obviously did not take this lightly, and he marched with his troops on Rome. Also a monumental deal. But at this point, his main focus was undoing the chicanery that saw him lose his command, which he did, and then he went off and proceeded to smoke Mithridates in battle, pushing him back out of Greece. While he was away doing this, though, old Marius and his allies seized back control of the government and declared him an outlaw, so Sulla marched on Rome again. But this time, he soundly defeated Marius and the rest of the populares after a brutal civil war. At the conclusion of this, he would take for himself the role of dictator, and with it, he would not only revamp Roman politics, he would also purge his enemies through the use of what was known as the proscriptions. Every day a list would be publicly disseminated with the names of those deemed to be the enemies of Rome, and if you found yourself on that list, you were, without exaggeration, fucked on every level, as you essentially lost the protection of the law and had a price put on your head. Literally, anyone who beheaded a prescribed individual could redeem it for a large sum and could do so without the risk of any prosecution. Furthermore, slaves of a prescribed person would earn complete manumission if they turned on their owner and led to their execution. Any property of said person was confiscated and became owned by the state, and eventually it got to such a point that some found themselves on the list simply for being one of Rome's wealthiest or having coveted assets. The fictional character of Lucius Caelius that joins the rebels during Season 2 is a small nod to this, as he mentions his family got caught up in the purge and was destroyed.
I did have more esteemed lodgings once. A villa, land, horses. A family. Struck from this world by Sulla's black heart.
If you want to know more about these topics, you should go check out the channel Flashback. They have a great video on it and deserve much more of a following, which, you know, I might just happen to know a little something about. Anyway, I'll link it down below. Make sure to go check it out when you have a chance and show them some love. Sulla did eventually relinquish the dictatorship and died about a year after doing so in 78 BC, about 5 years before the start of our show's timeline. I tell you all this for a couple of reasons. One, because Sulla's fingerprints are all over some of the events we're about to cover, which I will point out when we get to them, but also to give you further context of the state of Rome's affairs at the time. They were about 5 to 10 years removed from a brutal civil war and the horrible aftermath. They were fighting major conflicts on two fronts, with the top political officials battling Mithridates in the east, and the top general of the time, Pompey, quelling a major uprising in Spain to the west. Given all of that, it's easy to see why Spartacus's rebellion was just not a major priority, and why the assignment to snuff it out went to the man we know as Gaius Claudius Glabra. In the show, Glabra is begrudgingly assigned to this role, deemed below his new position of praetor, due to his established rivalry with Spartacus and the perception that he brought this headache to Rome, and if he wants to keep advancing, he's going to have to fix it. We already know that the rivalry is just a plot device for the show, and we don't know much about the real Glabra, but let's speak on what we do know for a second. For one, given his name but lack of real historical notoriety, he was likely an outskirt member of the gens Claudia, one of the earliest and most established families in ancient Rome. This is further established in Season 2 when old Sexpestius Maximus here comments about one of Glabra's possible real ancestors, Appius Claudius Pulcher, losing a decisive battle to Hannibal. It's also safe to say he likely did have some sort of military experience, as 7 to 10 years of military service was pretty much mandatory before being able to run for office. See, because Romans had a, well, romanticized notion, wordplay, that good soldiers would translate to good politicians, and the two things just went together, kind of like famous influencers and problematic relationships with minors.
Allegedly.
However, given the lack of concrete info on Glauber, it's also safe in my opinion to assume that he was nowhere near as high ranking as the Legatus position he is placed in during Season 1, as this authority would have come with his election to his new title in Season 2, and he most certainly did not outrank people like Marcus Crassus, as Batiatus indicates.
Crassus' wealth is undeniable. Yet he but holds the rank of senator. Glauber outweighs with that of legatus.
Speaking of rank, this is where we're going to circle back to all those political titles you've heard sprinkled in at times, as they made up the political ladder of Rome known as the Cursus Honorum. What was the Cursus Honorum? Translated to mean course of honors, the order of ranks that an aspiring politician had to work his way through if he wanted to get to the top of the food chain was a mixture of military and political administration roles with essentially 4 major steps: Quaestor, Aedile, Praetor, and Consul. Yes, before you comment, there were more possible roles that one could attain along the way or directly after, but for time's sake, these are the primary 4 to focus on. I'm going to do a broad overview, but if you want to know more, you should check out Historia Civilis if you haven't already, as he has much more in-depth videos on this, and he's also very close to the 1 million sub mark, so go help him get there and learn way more about this than I could ever teach. Anyway, so all these appointments would be set at 1 year long so as to prevent anyone from getting too comfortable in a role. Just gonna let that sit there for a second, and okay. The first rung of the Cursus Honorum would be the Quaestors, which had 20 appointments made per year. This would have had a minimum age restriction of 30 years old, and as we mentioned before, came with a lifetime appointment to the Senate. There were many different types of Quaestors, as some could be assigned to a treasury or a granary, but broadly speaking, these guys served as apprentices, so to speak, for the more senior magistrates we're about to cover. They would assist with administrative tasks such as tax collecting, auditing, overseeing public auctions for seized properties, etc., but could be called upon in times of battle as well. The real-life Batiatus served in this role a few years prior to our show's timeline, but as we know, this is as far as he got, which was the story for many a Quaestor, as this was an attainable position for a young wealthy aristocrat or someone with a good family name, but this proved to be the ceiling for most people. Show Batiatus, on the other hand, would announce his campaign for the role of Aedile, which is the next level up one could go for once they had reached their mid-30s, and this one was one of the more unique roles in that it was not a required step, but unlike the others above it, you also did not have to serve as Quaestor before you could go for it. The reason many did elect to take a turn as Aedile is because these were the men who were in charge of the plannings of festivals and games, and this was a great way to get name recognition and some love for the public. So you see, this would make sense as a perfect role for Batiatus we see in the show to try to get elected for. However, this role was an expensive one to hold, as most Aediles paid for these extravagancies out of their own pockets to curry favor. Moreover, the position also came with the overseeing of city upkeep such as temples, aqueducts, roads, public baths, sewers, and much, much more. Essentially, serving in this spot was a sign to the masses that you were committed to public service, and it was nice to have on the old resume, as there were only 4 elected per year. Next up, when a man turned 39, he was eligible to run for the office of Praetor, and this is where the real power started. 8 of these were appointed per year, and a praetor's main function is best likened to a judge who was to oversee Roman law was enforced. But this would be a much bigger deal back in the day, as the Romans were fiercely proud of their legal system. Also, even though trials would have looked very much like our own do today, one of the big differences is that court proceedings at the time were a major public deal and were attended by many spectators, complete with full audience participation, such as cheers and boos, jokes being made at the expense of those on trial, and even full-on crowd brawls. See, while in today's world a court case does indeed become a spectacle if a famous person is on trial, in ancient Rome the stars were the people arguing and judging the case, and so it was not uncommon for fans of these folks to come and see their favorite present at their big trial. Nowadays that just doesn't happen without being tied to representing a celebrity in some fashion, or I guess you could always wait around for this.
I took 100 of the country's top legal minds and I put them all in a circle where they will take turns presenting defenses for my various alleged potential legal issues. And the one or possibly multiple of them that come up with the best arguments are each going to win this retainer fee of $500,000. I don't care how long it takes, I am not going to end up persona non grata like Logan.
In addition to this, praetors were also the first rung on the ladder where you could actually begin to push an agenda as far as making changes to Roman law, which we will come back to more when we discuss the next position. However, the biggest perk that came with this is that they wielded what was called imperium, which in essence granted them the ability to stand at the head of an army. And while they were still subservient to anyone higher in position, this meant you could find yourself called upon basically to stand second in command, such as Glaber's real-life assignment to bring in Spartacus likely came from the simple fact that Rome was embroiled in so many other conflicts that the job would need to fall to a praetor. Where the Imperium was especially handy though was once the praetor left office, because then they were officially able to be assigned as governor to one of Rome's many provinces. And once they were there, away from the Senate's watchful eye, they could pretty much do whatever they wanted.
Because I'm a stud. I'm ballsy. I don't take no shit from anyone.
This included things such as openly taking massive bribes and leading conquests of unconquered lands where they kept a portion of the spoils of war. The fact is, most use this as a time to enrich themselves and make back much of the money that they spent getting to that spot. Unquestionably though, the most sought after position in all of Rome was that of the consul. Only 2 were elected every year, with one of them taking the lead in a sense for a month and then passing it over to the other for the next month, and so on. This was called holding fasces. This would be best likened to how we perceive the presidency in America, and it was the absolute pinnacle of a politician's career, as attaining it forever changed one's life. Once a man had been elected consul, the way he was perceived was forever established as one of Rome's made men, and the prestige it brought to one's family could set them up for generations to come and have your name spoken of in the highest of regards long after you were dead.
He was a consul of Rome!
To give you an idea of how big of a deal this office was, just know that Roman citizens did not mark the year of their birth in the way that we do today by saying, I was born in the year 73 BC. Instead, they would say, I was born during the consulship of Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Essentially, the consuls were the head of the Roman state, trusted with defending the Republic as the supreme military commanders, and for setting the political agenda of the time. See, they had the ability to call the Roman Senate to meet at any time, and when they would convene to debate or vote on an issue, the speaking order went as such. First, the consuls would each get their say, then any former consul would get to speak, followed by that year's elected praetors. Then the former praetors, and then if they got that far, which eventually they pretty much never did, the quaestors would get to weigh in. Knowing that, it's pretty easy to see how the entire political landscape could end up dominated by only a few, as they were the only ones who ever got to argue their point. The consuls could also veto any legislation put forward, and even veto someone else's request for the Senate to meet, basically picking and choosing what would be debated and when. They also oversaw and policed the elections for the following year's positions, and so being consul meant you had unilateral authority to give your allies a leg up for their upcoming ambitions, or take a well-placed bribe for someone looking for a favor. Anyway, when Sulla marched on Rome, he was one of that year's consuls, and now that you have the context, you can see how Marius stealing his command out from under him was an unprecedented thing, because even though Marius was a former multiple-time consul himself, this was just not done. It would basically be like whomever is the current president while you're watching this, getting their commander-in-chief position taken from them by like George Bush or Bill Clinton or something. It would be a massive deal. Once Sulla had stepped down, one of the reforms he put in place was a 10-year gap in which a former consul had to wait before he could hold the office again, which didn't last, but in theory it was a good idea. Like I said, there is way more to this, but at the very least, this is a basic understanding of how it worked. Alright, now that all that is out of the way, let's come up for air and get back to the rebellion. So one thing we can say for sure is that the real-life Glaber very likely felt the same way his show counterpart does about this assignment being beneath him, as you're about to see. For one thing, at first, Rome plainly just did not take this seriously at all, as evidenced by the fact that Glaber was not given regular soldiers, but militia. He was likely told to pick up whatever forces he could get while on the way, and while theoretically this area should have been the geographic home to hardened veterans who previously served under Sulla, they were unlikely to chase a seemingly glory-deficient quest in order to help some nobody.
A nobody? Who farted? Nobody!
The name might have given it away, but Spartacus's revolt would come to be known as the Third Servile War, which meant this was not the first time the Republic had seen a major slave uprising. In fact, they were seeming to become a trend about every 30 years or so. About 60 years prior to our timeline, a Syrian slave named Eunice, who claimed to be a prophet, led a violent insurrection on the island of Sicily, capturing one of the cities in the middle and using it as a base of operations. This was likely due to the fact that around this time the Sicilian slaves were dealing with new arriving masters who had just acquired much of the area, and they were much crueler to them than what they had previously been accustomed to. They would end up defeating 4 separate praetors sent with militia forces before eventually they were finally put down. Then, about 30 years later, also on the island of Sicily, the Second Servile War would break out, and to sum it up quickly, this time it was due to a situation where about 800 slaves were granted freedom by the consul as part of a recruiting drive for soldiers, and when the owners of those slaves heard about this, they said,
"The fuck you are."
And so they decided to take backsies on that whole freedom thing, to which the slaves replied,
"The fuck you are."
And from there it was on. This lasted for about 4 years but was contained to Sicily and eventually was crushed by the Romans under the consul Manius Aquilius. Capua itself had seen a minor slave revolt not terribly long before this one as well, that was led by a Roman citizen who was a former knight, but this one was put down quickly by a praetor with less than a single legion. So as you can see, it's somewhat understandable why Rome didn't bat too much of an eye at Spartacus and his group, since nothing like this had ever really amounted to a whole lot before, and praetors had been sufficient previously in routing would-be slave kings. Plus, after all, the last attempt had been led by a former Roman who was no match, and these were mere barbarian gladiators, so they assumed Glauber could handle this with even less of a force than previous revolts. Barry Strauss goes even further in with how he describes it in the Spartacus War. For the Romans, gladiators were to be fed, trained, cheered, adored, ogled, bedded, buried, and even occasionally freed, but never to be treated as equals. From the Roman point of view, once Spartacus and his 73 companions left their barracks, they were no longer gladiators. They had shrunk from a fight, hence they were moral lepers, cowardly, effeminate, and degenerate. They had shrunk from the glory of the arena to the shame of the banditry. They were not soldiers, but runaway slaves, fugitivi. As a slave and a Thracian barbarian, Spartacus was despicable to Romans, and as a former allied soldier, he was pathetic. Alithia even comments on this back in Season 1.
The duality of his kind. Admired as a gladiator, yet despised as a slave.
They were sorely mistaken, though, as this was very different from before, and Spartacus's personal particular skills would have made him Liam Neeson levels of uniquely suited to leading this charge, so underestimating him would prove to be costly.
Y'all got skills? What are you gonna do about it?
Spartacus's Thracian upbringing would have given him excellent skills as a horseman, excelling in hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, trickery, and deception, and other means of unconventional warfare. His years living in the mountains would have given him extensive knowledge of how to attack from and defend a higher position, and Thracians were also natural plunderers, so he would have known how to make good use of anything they came by. However, the secret weapon that he possessed that others before him did not was that he had personal experience serving in the Roman war machine as part of their auxiliary. This meant that he not only knew Roman strategies and battle tactics for when it came time to engage them, but that he could use that knowledge to bring the insane organization and training methods to his own men to mold them into a formidable force with a specialty in fighting Romans. His years honing his own personal fighting skills in the arena could not have hurt either, and I'm sure he was more than a match for the average soldier, which many of them would soon find out. In the show, the decision to go to Vesuvius is not exactly a clear-cut one, as Crixus has his intent set on rescuing Naevia, and after he receives news that she was passed as a gift from rich Dominus to rich Dominus in the countryside, his attempts to find her become the catalyst for the group raiding wealthy villas in the area, which is something they did do. And I just want to take a second to point out really quickly that they are really committed to doing this bit where someone is about to orgasm and we get a scene of that person being like stabbed or blood spatter of some kind as a replacement for the climax, which I admit was highbrow art as a younger man, but this time around it was definitely a depreciating joke.
Come on, that's funny.
So we find out eventually Naevia was cast off to the mines, and this causes a split in the group as to what actions to take next, as Crixus wants to embark on a seemingly assured suicide rescue mission, while Agron, one of Spartacus's other top lieutenants, moves towards Vesuvius with eyes on eventually raiding the port city of Neapolis, where fighting warriors who could swell their ranks are regularly trafficked as slaves. The character of Agron is fictional, but who, stay with me for a second, is essentially a stand-in at times for a real person that was known as Castus, who does appear later in the series under totally different circumstances, and whom we will come back to at that time. Anyway, now there were most certainly differences in opinion as far as strategically what to do next, but in real life at this point it mostly had to do with quests for riches, and while there would be a formal split coming, it wouldn't be for quite some time yet. Instead, I think this is the writer's way of not only creating drama, but also highlighting that the group was likely moving at times in 2 or more sections executing different plans. As for whether Spartacus and his crew ever actually rolled up on the mines or Neapolis, there are no records that say they did, but at least for the mines, it was highly unlikely as they would have been in search for more able-bodied and trainable fighters to liberate, and the majority of those that made up the ranks of the mines would not have fit that description. The way the mines are depicted as, for all intents and purposes, hell on earth is pretty accurate though. They also never attacked Capua's arena either as depicted, since this would have had a 0% chance of success, and so logistically this would have been a nonsensical move. Most of this is really just filler though, as a means to give our characters something to do of note while they ultimately make their way to the mountain by the end of the season. There was no badass siege at the base of the mountain like we see in the show, because in real life Spartacus and his group actually lived on the mountain itself, and when Glauber and his soldiers arrived, they just made base camp at the hills of Vesuvius, which actually was not a crazy notion as the rebels had an advantageous defensive position, or
I have the high ground!
There was only one road up the mountain, and it was not anywhere near ideal to march a legion up, let alone a thrown-together group of forces, and so he assumed the better course of action would be waiting and starving out the gladiators. It's not a groundbreaking strategy, but it probably would have worked had they kept their guards up just a bit better. They figured the rebels couldn't get down the steep and jagged side of the mountain, so they pretty much just left it unguarded, and as Napoleon once said, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. Remember the folks I mentioned in the previous part that were from the rural countryside and came to join Spartacus on the mountain? Well, they proved valuable since they were familiar with using wild grapevines to weave baskets that they used for farm work. These vines were in abundance on the mountain, but contrary to the visions on the show, they did not rappel down, as these might have been strong, but not that strong. Rather, these were probably used more like handholds and support as they carefully climbed down the steep terrain. The 1 or 2 that were left behind up on the peak then tossed the weapons down, and the gladiators were suddenly poised to strike. They then attacked the Romans' defensive camp, with one source saying they were able to surround it, and another saying they possibly snuck in through a hidden exit or through a crevice, but either way, the Romans were caught completely off guard, with many of them being slaughtered in their tents.
Surprise, motherfucker!
Not being able to get into formation left many of those who did try to fight in a 1v1 match with a seasoned gladiator, and the majority were no match. The insurgents then plundered the spoils, which no doubt replenished them with food and more weapons, and then likely assumed control of the camp itself as their new base of operations. We don't know how many Romans were killed, but it's safe to assume a good majority. We also don't know what happened to Glauber, as he is not officially recorded as killed in this skirmish, but he also is never mentioned among historical records of any kind after this. This could mean that he either perished, or that possibly he was so humiliated by this defeat that he fucked right off out of politics entirely. and so ultimately giving us the payoff of Spartacus personally being the one to kill him and fulfill his vengeance is perfectly fine with me. Another major death that occurs during this point in the show is that of Enemaeus, when he is killed by the most creatively named character in the whole show, the Egyptian. We don't know for sure how, and it likely wasn't on Vesuvius itself, but in the real records of what happened, it's referenced that he fell in battle somewhere around this time, and so their placement of it as a massive event here is good with me as well. At this point, word of the rebels' success was beginning to spread, and with it, they got another influx of runaway slaves. This time mostly herdsmen who would have been primarily Celts and would have known the area incredibly well, serving as the perfect scouts for what would come next. After Glaber's defeat reached the ears of Rome, they sent 2 more praetors to try essentially the same thing, Publius Varinius and Lucius Cosinius. We meet Varinius in the show much earlier, where he is placed as Glaber's rival, trying to snatch up literally everything from him, but this was done for drama's sake, as the real Varinius was sent in response to Glaber's defeat, and the show pulls a little switcheroo in the timing of their dealings with the rebels, but it's not a huge thing. So I think it's safe to say he probably didn't finger fuck his wife.
You sure you got the right hole?
With their new additions paying dividends early, Spartacus and his group next surprise and rout Varinius' legate named Furius along with 2,000 of his men, and then shortly after that, they catch Praetor Cosinius slipping and ambush him while he is bathing. We see them get killed in the first episode of the final season, but it's depicted differently, and it's implied that their position was given away as a strategic move by Marcus Crassus to assume command, but in reality, Crassus was yet to officially enter the chat. Varinius' and Spartacus' forces play a period of cat and mouse for a bit, and this appears to be where we get the beginning of the split between Spartacus and Crixus. As it is recorded, Crixus likely wanted to attack Varinius and continue taking the fight to Rome, whereas Spartacus was of the mind that while they had had success, they were not winning, and this was likely due to the fact that he had served in the Roman army and knew what they were up against better than his Gallic counterpart, despite what we see in the show where he is not as keenly aware of this. His real plan was to try and flee north to the Alps, where they could then split up and return to the areas of their homelands that were still beyond Rome's reach. But see, many of the Celts and Germans that made up his forces were likely born into slavery in Italy, and so the idea of going home probably just didn't mean the same, and in the end Spartacus was outvoted. However, they did manage to at least compromise that they needed more time to prepare before squaring up to Varinius. So, they marched south into the pasture lands to recruit more herdsmen to their cause and to buy more time to train for the battle to come. They also likely would have taken local prisoners, such as ranch or farm owners, to help be their eyes and ears in the area, and this helped them to evade and stay many steps ahead of the Romans in pursuit. Their next stop would have been a little farming town known as Forum Ane, where we are told the group goes absolutely mad, pillaging and killing everyone in sight against Spartacus' orders. We see this battle of wills play out in the show as far as the treatment of Roman civilians, and we're told in real life Spartacus did understand the importance of imagery and not wanting to appear as the savage barbarians they were claimed to be.
I've never seen them act like that before.
After that, for the next 6 months or so, the sources get a little light again as far as the information, but we do know that at some point during this time period, the rebels engage and defeat Varinius. And while I really enjoy the way they see him off in the show, in real life he escaped with his life and retreated back to Rome. We don't know for sure what happened to him after that, and there is a Publius Varinius who was governor of the province of Asia about a decade later, but we can't say with certainty that he is the same guy. What is true, though, is that Spartacus ended up with his horse, and the rebels also seized Varinius' standards, which are banners and symbols of the legions that are extremely protected, and ultimately would have been the slap in the face that formally made the Romans see this for the threat that it really was. It also gave Spartacus, who was already likely a household name by this point, godlike levels of fear, fame, and infamy.
Because I'm a stud. I'm ballsy. I don't take no shit from anyone.
A massive influx of new recruits followed, and with numbers varying by source, a good solid estimate based on historical context would put them at around 40,000 at this point. Rome finally now understood what it was up against, and they were about to up the ante in every measurable way. With us now heading into the third and final season of the show, I want to stop for just a moment and comment on something that happens at the end of season 2 that I found pretty neat, and that is the fate of the character of Lucretia. In season 2, after it is discovered she survived the slaughter of the Breakout, and after some clever maneuvering, Lucretia is proclaimed to be a blessing from the gods, and she begins to essentially act as an oracle, or as they would have referred to them, a sibyl. The Romans did have beliefs in oracles and seers, and would certainly look to them in times of distress for direction given directly from the gods. The use of her in this place as a sign from them would have been an incredibly prudent maneuver as a way to keep the public from panicking, but she would have been saddled with the expectation of then walking the walk by actually being right about the predictions.
What does it mean? Well, could mean a surprise visit from a former friend or sweetheart. Or that you're going on a long sea voyage. Could I come? I've never been on a boat.
She essentially spends the duration of the time stuck as a plaything for Ashur, but also acting as a loyal friend, looking out for Ilithia and her unborn child's protection above all, which turns out to be nothing but a long con, as when the moment is right, she cuts the baby out of her BFF, takes it to the villa's cliffside edge, and all while looking the baby's mother dead in the eye, falls backwards with him to their deaths in an effort to bring a son to her husband, who is waiting in the afterlife. That is Macho Man Randy levels of savage. Now, apparently they are going to retcon this somehow in order to bring Lucy Lawless back for House of Ashur, which was just announced, and honestly, I have super mixed feelings about it because while I would love to see her again in the show, I feel like that was an absolutely picture-perfect ending, and I hate to see it undone, especially when there is what I believe to be a nice little wink to a historical reference in it according to Roman tradition. There is no for sure way to back this up, but the recount of it comes from the same historian Livy that was sourced for the accounts of Spartacus, if that speaks to its authenticity. However, he speaks of a Roman noblewoman named Lucretia who lived in 510 BC and was the victim of the same type of assault as show Lucretia. However, the real-life person was assaulted by the son of the last original king of Rome, and the trauma and shame it brought forced her to the same end as the show counterpart, although she did it with a dagger to the heart. This event was the spark that would lead to the overthrow of the aforementioned king and set up the Roman Republic that would stand for nearly 500 years. As you can see, the parallels are certainly there, and it's things like this that show the amount of care that went into crafting this show, and I applaud the writers for such passion to it.
God bless you.
So after beating Verinius and his group, geographically now the rebels had made their way to the Gulf of Taranto, and after attacking and recruiting in a city called Metapontum, they then made their way to the area of Brutium, and this would serve as their new base of operations while they planned for their next move and further trained and equipped their army. This would have been an ideal spot given all the advantages the area provided, such as horses, slaves, food, and natural cover, and so they would soon take the city of Turi, and this is where they would winter. In the show, they instead take the city of Sinuessa, and I don't really know why the reason is for the change, but there you go. One interesting thing, though, is that a lot of the slaves that escaped from Spartacus's ultimate defeat ran back to this city and were taken in until Julius Caesar's great-nephew Octavius came for them in 60 BC and wiped them out. Now, going forward, the show timeline bends considerably apart from the actual historical one, but we're going to do our best to outline things. For one, the next group that was sent against Spartacus was left out of the show entirely, and you'll soon see why that's a big deal in real life. After the praetors that had been sent had failed so miserably, the Senate had decided that it was time for the bigger guns, and they sent in both of the consuls elected for the year 72, Gellius and Clodianus, at the head of a sizable force. What happens next in real life doesn't happen until much later in the show, but this is where Spartacus and Crixus formally split up with different factions of the followers. No one can say with certainty whether this was a strategic split or one born of a difference in philosophy, but it's likely that this was an amicable separation with intent on maybe meeting back up at some point later. Based on each of their next moves, we can say with some certainty that the show's explanation is pretty accurate in that Spartacus wanted to lead those that no longer wish to carry on the fight northward past the Alps and hopefully out of Rome's vast shadow, whereas Crixus and those like him that were emboldened by their recent victories wanted to continue the war and march on Rome itself. Upon receiving the intel that the forces had split, the consuls decided to do the same, with Clodianus keeping pace with Spartacus and Gellius charged with hunting down Crixus's group and then hooking back around to rejoin the hunt for Spartacus. Gellius tracked Crixus and about 30,000 of the rebels to the area near Mount Garganus and engaged them. Now, one thing we need to clarify as well is some facts about Crixus as a general. In the show, he is shown to be a competent leader and strategist, but all historical evidence points to the fact that the real military brains of the outfit was Spartacus, and Crixus was not anywhere on the same level when it came to waging war.
You would brand me as such?
This was pretty evident by this battle, as he was simply outgeneraled and outmaneuvered by his Roman opponent, and the rebels would be absolutely routed, with 2/3 of them being killed in battle, including our undefeated Gaul. Chronologically in the show, if they were being true to actual events, this would be happening in like episode 2 or 3 of the final season, rather than towards the end of it as it is. But Crixus was a popular major character, and so I understand the time bending to allow for him to be around for the whole time. It's recorded that when Spartacus and his group reached the Alps, that they abruptly turned back and decided to head back south. Some posit this was because they heard the news of Crixus's defeat and death and wished vengeance, and some say that it's likely that when the group led by Spartacus saw something that they had never seen before in the sheer mass that was the Alps mountains, that this led lots of them to lose their nerve. Accounts begin to differ here amongst our sources as to the next chain of events, but they don't contradict each other, so to speak, so all of it could be true in a way. Appian's account is that the rebels defeated each of the consular forces separately and then pursued them to Picenum, where he then defeated the combined forces in a pitched battle. He also makes mention of something we see in the show where Spartacus and his men take 300 captured Roman soldiers and hold an honorary day of gladiatorial games in Crixus's honor, forcing these men to fight to the death as they once had to. News of this would have likely sickened those back in Rome, not so much for the fighting to the death, but for the mere fact that its soldiers were placed on equal ground as slaves, and that was humiliating. Plutarch's version is that Spartacus defeated Clodianus's troops, and then also defeated the governor of Cisalpine Gaul and 10,000 of his men who attempted to block their progress. But he makes no mention of a big pitched battle against both consular armies. Either way, what the sources do come back to agree upon is that in the aftermath of the battles, the consuls were recalled to Rome in shame and forced to relinquish command in exchange for their political careers to be able to continue, failing upward, if you will. With the Republic stretched as far as could be with conflicts and running out of options, the choice for who to turn to was clear: a popular, powerful man who could finance the entire campaign out of his own pocket. Marcus Licinius Crassus. Who was Marcus Crassus? Well, as we have already mentioned, typically when his name is brought up, it conjures up images of one thing. Crassus was the second of 3 sons of his father Publius, who had been consul in the year 95 BC, and while he belonged to an established plebeian family, he could be described as being from a modest upbringing. His older brother passed away when Crassus was 24, and a couple of years later, his father and younger brother both got caught up in the civil war between Marius and Sulla, with each of them either being killed by Marius's forces or taking their own lives depending on the source. Marcus himself was not an important enough player at this point, so he did not suffer the same fate and was able to hide out in Spain, but in hindsight, they maybe should have put more effort into it, because Crassus would join up with Sulla for his march on Rome as one of the new dictator's top generals, ultimately proving to be pivotal in the deciding battle. He then used his close proximity and newfound position to take advantage during the proscriptions we talked about earlier. Remember how I said Rome's wealthiest began finding themselves on the list just so their assets could be seized? Well, Crassus was the one doing a good bit of the seizing, and when prominent Romans lost their properties and lands, he began buying them up left and right for essentially pennies on the dollar, then reselling them for exorbitant amounts. In a short amount of time, Crassus got filthy fucking rich and started being referred to as the richest man in Rome. Some things never change because, like many others that attain the title of wealthiest person around, he certainly did a good bit of selling his soul and destroying others to get there. One thing he did to further extend his wealth and real estate portfolio was to start Rome's first fire brigade, and if that sounds weird how those two things go together, well, let me explain. See, if your house caught fire back in these times, you could expect a visit from Marcus Crassus, where he would make you an offer to sell your still ablaze home for a small fraction of its original worth, arguing you may as well get something for it before it's worth nothing. Then, if you sold, he would have his team of slaves put out the fire and immediately begin restoring it to flip and sell it for a crazy profit. And if you refused to sell, well, at least you had company while you watched everything burn to ashes. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, he also married his dead brother's widow, Tertulla, so Just throwing that out there. Anyway, at this point in his career, and when we first meet him in the show, he was a man who was beginning to feel as though he was not living up to his ambitions, as he had served as praetor the year before when the revolt broke out, but he was a few years off of what the normal track up the ladder was in terms of where you were supposed to be at this time, and he desired the consulship as soon as possible. In Rome's system, where military accomplishments were held above all, one's bank account could only take them so far on the way up. He had also been eclipsed in accomplishments by his political and personal rival, Pompey the Great, whom had already received a military triumph at this point, which I don't have time to give you all the glorious details of what they entail, but just know that this was the highest honor one could receive, and they were essentially the greatest parades that ever existed. I'm serious, Macy's could never. The rivalry with Pompey and the envy Crassus felt, having not had his own Super Sweet 16 yet, was a major detail of his life that you will want to keep in mind for later, as it shaped his entire destiny. To him, having a special command under his belt where he could possibly save Rome in the eyes of the people from this slave rebellion menace, that was exactly the kind of thing that could take him straight to the top. Also, Crassus would have had a personal stake in ending this in a timely fashion, as he owned many properties in the area where the rebels were running loose, and he needed to protect his investments. This arrangement seemed as though it was win-win for all involved, and so the change in command was made official in late 72 BC, with Crassus being awarded 6 new legions and absorbing the remaining 2 that had been serving the consuls, giving him a rough estimate of about 40,000 men plus auxiliaries. One big change the show makes is the inclusion of his son Tiberius, who is placed in the role of the petulant child, refusing to heed his father's advice or live up to his expectations, somewhat similar to Commodus from Gladiator, and ends up the most villainous of all the villainous. Well, Crassus did have 2 sons, as was shown. Their names were Publius and Marcus, but at this point in time they would have been about 13 and 9, so they would not be accompanying their father on this particular quest. However, we will talk about one of them again before the end of this video. Now, once the new commander was in place, he knew that he had to send a message that this time was going to be different, and one of his first moves he would make would illustrate this as he reinstituted the Long Sunset Act of decimating his forces. The group of men that were selected would have been divided into groups of 10 and forced to draw lots, with the person drawing the short one being killed by the other 9 in his group, either by stabbing, stoning, or clubbing. This was done absent rank and absent fault in whatever the matter was that caused it. Decimation was a punishment typically reserved for the worst of offenses committed by a military force, such as mutiny, but in Crassus's case, it had a very clear purpose. He wanted his forces to fear him more than Spartacus, and what he would do to them if they retreated from battle.
Because I'm a stud. I'm ballsy. I don't take no shit from anyone.
It's unclear from the sources if he also performed this on the troops that had been part of the consuls' armies that he acquired, but the more famous incident is the one we see play out in the show. Just like in real life, Crassus had given strict command to his scouting party to find Spartacus's position, but not to engage the rebels until the main force arrived. In the show, it's Tiberius who hastily defies orders, but in reality, it was Crassus's legate Mummius, the one who gets torched to a crisp, who attacks at the first advantageous position he saw. However, they would be absolutely mauled by the rebels and sent in a full retreat with their tails tucked firm. Crassus was absolutely furious at the insubordination, and even worse, the embarrassment of technically losing the first engagement of his command, and this would be the triggering event for the decimation. The real Mummius wouldn't be killed, but he would be stripped of rank and dismissed from duty, going on to be formally exiled from within 500 miles of the city of Rome, and basically be publicly embarrassed into obscurity. But I'm okay with the switch to Tiberius, as it's a small thing, and they sort of line him up like an evil Forrest Gump, becoming integral to shaping the events by being present at notable real moments, or being in proximity to notable real people, such as being the one to deliver the finishing blow to Crixus, or having himself a Caesar salad.
I understand you were wounded. Where were you hit?
In the buttocks, sir.
Speaking of Big Julius Coolius, let's move on to what is quite possibly the biggest inaccuracy that the show commits over its entire course, and that is the insertion of Caesar into the story, where he goes undercover posing as a rebel in order to destroy them from the inside. Todd LaSance does a great job with the character, and he's a fun addition to the show, but the real Caesar and Spartacus never officially crossed paths, as during the revolt, he was off somewhere else fulfilling the role of military tribune. As an interesting little tidbit though, Caesar did go on to own Eleusis and Capua a little over 20 years later. Crassus and Caesar were allies in real life as the wealthy veteran funded the young upstart's ambitions financially, and Caesar would eventually come to play a role in the rivalry with Pompey we mentioned earlier as well, but this is a work of fiction. That's not to say that it isn't possible Crassus tried to get one of his own behind enemy lines, but it's not something that is recorded as having happened, and for what it's worth, we do know that at this time Spartacus turned down several deserters for either that exact fear of espionage, or also possibly just a cold assessment of their abilities and what they could add to his force, which was now about at its height, with numbers placing it reliably at 60,000 plus. Rome didn't mind being outnumbered though, and despite the early setback, Crassus is still able to soon engage Spartacus again, and this time they were able to get a victory, killing around 6,000 of his men. This would prove to be the turning point, as it was followed up by several more consecutive victories for the Romans, which sent the rebels retreating south to the straits near Messina after losing several thousand more of their forces. Crassus would then set up a blockade across the isthmus, cutting Spartacus off from the rest of Italy and trapping him to try to force an engagement. Geographically running out of options, Spartacus tried to broker passage with some Cilician pirates to the island of Sicily, with the thinking being not only keeping ground between them and their pursuers, but also to possibly reignite some of the rebellious former sentiments of the island. In the show, the alliance with the pirates comes under very different circumstances and happens while they are occupying the city of Sinuessa, where we find out that the former city magistrate had an underground deal with the pirate captain Heraclio. Spartacus makes a deal, but it's mainly for supplies and food to keep their ever-growing force from starvation, which was a real-life problem as well. We also find out that the pirates in fact take Spartacus and some of his men to Sicily to raid Crassus's food stocks, and they mention intent to travel there permanently, but it is explained that it was intended as a diversionary move to hit the Romans even harder. The pirates end up selling the rebels out to Crassus, and their plan fails, forcing a retreat into the mountains. A couple of things real quick. One is that the character of Heraclio is, at least in namesake, based off of a famous pirate of the time that caused the Romans a tremendous amount of headaches with his raiding of their grain ships, but it's not clear if he's the person Spartacus was dealing with in real life. Also, this is where we meet the character of Castus. Now, Castus was a real person and was one of the major lieutenants in the insurgency, whereas in the show they make him a pirate under Heraclio's command, who comes to eventually side with the insurgents. Being that Agron is the only major lieutenant in the show that is not based off of a real person, it stands to reason that some of his character inspiration is drawn from him, like I mentioned earlier. But the real Castus was not a German or a Numidian, but was more likely a Celt, or some have even posited that he could have been a Roman that had fallen into slavery. There is no way to know for sure, and it's not that big of a thing honestly. It is kind of funny though, the idea of two characters based off the same person pursuing the same love interest.
Technically it's not cheating, baby. Well, Felicity, I can't blame you. The man is handsome, baby. We're just plain handsome, man.
Anyway, the real-life events were way less complicated, as the pirates didn't align with the Romans, but basically just took their money and ran, leaving Spartacus high and dry. We know that they did attempt to build rafts and sail the strait themselves. However, these were not sailors, and they were attempting this late in the year when the crossing was at its most dangerous, so it failed miserably. This was the moment that the group would have had no other choice but to flee into the Aspromonte Mountains and make camp for the winter. The Romans then begin building fortifications to essentially funnel the only possible escape route to one confined area where they could fight on their terms. The sources are extra contradictory about some of this as well, as Plutarch says Crassus had a 30-plus mile long wall built as a means to achieve this, but we can probably chalk this up to a history being written by the winners type thing, as this was likely an exaggeration. As impressive of engineers as the Romans certainly were, this would have proved difficult, and it's far more likely that because the vast majority of the area in this region is impassable as it is, that only a small amount of fortifications were needed. But either way, Crassus now had his killing field ready and the rebels right where he wanted them, with seemingly nothing left to do but wait for Spartacus to make one more mistake so he could finish them off once and for all. Spartacus's once roaring fire that threatened to burn down the Republic was now clinging to embers of life, with the strength of the Hawk Tuah girl clinging to her 15 minutes.
Come on, you really gotta hawk it back, you know? Get some leverage to it and use your arms. Arc your neck.
And also, much like her, his time and unlikely success was reaching an inevitable end. A last stand was on the horizon. So you remember how I said that all Crassus had to do now was wait for the right moment to finish this? Well, as it turns out, the perfect moment to attack is when you find out your worst enemy is coming to steal your glory. In 71 BC, Crassus's old frenemy Pompey was fresh off quelling the major rebellion in Spain we mentioned earlier, and in doing so furthered his growing legend. With the Roman Senate growing frustrated at the delay in crushing Spartacus and beginning to feel as though maybe Crassus was not the man to deliver the killing blow, they decided it was time to recall Pompey to Italy and have him enter the fray as well. Pompey at the time also had eyes on running for the consulship in the following year, and this was certainly an opportunity to gain some more public favor, so he eagerly came marching to assistance. And if this wasn't bad enough for Crassus, he would then receive word that the governor of Macedonia was also on his way with troops, likely also dispatched by the Senate as sort of overkill. Crassus correctly understood that once these guys showed up, all of the credit for this campaign would be theirs for the taking in the eyes of the people, and so he implored his men that they could wait no longer, and that time was now of the utmost importance. This would lead to a moment we see play out in the show where Crassus would set a trap by intentionally setting up his personal camp unreasonably close to the enemy perimeter, almost goading them to attack, which they did, and were forced back into retreat up into the mountains. Spartacus then also learns of Pompey's impending arrival, and in the show, eventually uses the info to try to spring a trap in order to pose as the general and abduct Crassus during a planned meeting. However, what he did in real life was something arguably much bolder in nature at this point. He would attempt to make peace by sending envoys to Crassus. This fell on deaf ears though, because given how the slaves had spit in the face of Rome, and given all that Crassus had on the line personally, there was just no possible way he could entertain any sort of truce, and so he promptly told Spartacus to fuck right off. But just think for a second, if you're Crassus and you've been pursuing this guy to seemingly the ends of the earth and have begun to turn the tides finally in Rome's favor, and you have him dead to rights with reinforcements of your own on the way, and his response is, hey, if you guarantee us safety to lands outside of your borders, we can call this whole thing off. You'd almost have to be kinda tickled by the nerve of this fucking guy, right?
Alright, we'll call it a draw.
Left with no other option and the prospect of having to fight attacks from multiple sides if a decision wasn't made quickly, the group decided to attempt to break through the blockade and make a run for it. We're told that prior to the attempt, Spartacus crucified a Roman prisoner in the area between the two forces as a symbol to his men of what defeat or defection would bring to them, and it was evidently very effective in rallying them to purpose.
That's how winning is done!
The show's version sees the group fill part of the massive trench separating them from the Roman fortifications with the dead bodies of their own who had frozen to death during a winter storm. This allows them to create a bridge to cross and escape past the guards, fleeing out of Crassus's trap. Now, it's possible they did use the bodies of their fallen to do something like this, but it's safe to say that they were likely killed in battle or possibly died of starvation because, while they were in the mountains in wintertime, this was southern Italy. I'm sure it was chilly and uncomfortable and not ideal, but it's very unlikely they were dealing with snowstorms to the degree that we see in the show. One of the sources mentions also that it was the bodies of executed prisoners and cattle that formed their bridge. Either way, they were able to get out of what appeared to be being nailed dead to rights on the cross, and Crassus was left with shit on his face at the worst possible time. In the show, this is the moment that we get the split between Spartacus and Crixus's forces, and the group led by the latter makes it nearly all the way to the city of Rome before they are cut down by Crassus's forces. But as we already covered, Crixus has been gone for some time. In real life, it would be different lieutenants who would split off around this time, as it is recorded that a force of around 30,000, led by Gannicus and Castus, broke off from the main force. The reasoning isn't all the way clear. It could be a difference in strategic opinion or possibly some growing disillusion in Spartacus's leadership, but either way it would prove to be a grievous mistake. Crassus soon got wind of the divide and realized it was a massive tactical momentum shift, as he could now hunt down the smaller armies individually, and in roughly March of 71 BC, he caught up to the break-off force where they were absolutely routed by the Romans, with nearly all perishing in the fight or being taken prisoner and crucified. Both Gannicus and Castus were reported to have died on the battlefield this day, but in the show, both characters make it to the final confrontation, with Castus dying in battle there, and Gannicus being seized after nearly killing Caesar, and ultimately ends up crucified.
So that's like a metaphor
I do absolutely love how they did this though, given the backstory they give the character in the show, and so I have no problems with this. This was the quick W that Crassus needed to wipe clean his failings, finishing Spartacus earlier in the year, and as a huge cherry on top, they were able to recover many of the Roman standards that had been taken by the gladiators during previous victories. Between the high Crassus was flying over this, the sting of the low Spartacus likely felt getting the news, and their shared desire to end this before Pompey was able to get there, everyone seemed to be in agreement of a final confrontation. The Roman part of Spartacus's thinking style most certainly knew that they stood little chance in a pitched battle, but that Thracian spirit inside of him yearned for the honorable death of fighting to the last as a free man in charge of his own destiny. The rebel troops turned and marched toward what is the modern-day area of Synertia near the river Selle and prepared for either victory or death. And to drive this home, as part of his final rallying speech to his men, Spartacus sacrificed his horse in front of them, with the rationale being that if they were victorious, he would have plenty of good stock to choose from, and if not, he wouldn't need it anyway. You could say what you want about the tactical decision of now not having a horse to go into battle with, but I get what he was trying to do.
Because I'm a stud. I'm ballsy. I don't take no shit from anyone.
It's a safe bet the two commanders did not have a personal parlay with one another prior to the battle like we see in the show, but pretty much what we see play out from here is accurately reflected as pieced together from the sources. Spartacus's real strategy for this battle was to head straight for Crassus and try to kill the Roman spirit and will to fight by seeing their commander wiped out. He did attempt to challenge him to one-on-one combat, but was declined. The battle that commenced was a massive one, and we're told Spartacus fought tooth and nail, killing many Romans trying to carve a path to Crassus, but before he was able to, he was cut down by the legions. One source says that he was surrounded after many of his men abandoned him on the field, and that he died fighting. And another says that he was hit in the thigh from behind with a spear and forced down to his knees like we see happen. However, in the show, Agron shows up just in time to pull Spartacus's body to a place where he can have a somewhat peaceful final moment. The truth is, we do know he died in battle, and we know that his body was never recovered, so ultimately they can make whatever decision they want with this and it would be fine. All of the sources speak highly of the manner of Spartacus's death and state with a clear admiration of his spirit that he died fighting.
Would that you'd been born a Roman. That stood beside me.
It's likely that in real life his body was never recovered because he did not bear any special markings to distinguish him, and by the time the battle was over, it was too mangled to be identified. What we know is that exactly what Spartacus had hoped to achieve by knocking off Crassus is what instead happened to his men seeing their almost godlike leader finally fall in battle. The sources say that after their hero was gone, the rest of the rebel forces basically panic, erode, and flee, becoming an easy mop-up job for the Romans, with most of them being killed, and we're told that 6,000 or so of them that escaped this day were hunted down and then crucified along the Appian Way as a warning to would-be future revolt leaders. Many of the ones that actually did escape Crassus would be caught soon after by Pompey, who had finally just gotten to Italy, and he would do likewise in crucifying a large number of captured rebels. Just like we see in the show when Pompey arrives, he pretty much takes all the credit for everything as Crassus had feared, and this is basically what happened in real life, claiming his capture and crucifixion of the few rebels that escaped was the real victory, and the Senate loved Pompey so much at the time that they were happy to go along with that. Crassus had been denied his rightful kudos and was not awarded a triumph for his effort, as putting down a slave rebellion was deemed not worthy of such a thing, and so he was given a smaller, way less cool Super Sweet 16 party.
Don't tell me my car now. I told her not to get out. What did they do? My party? I didn't want the car. That's not even the car you wanted. Oh, this right now. I can't believe she's such an idiot. She just ruined the whole party. Everything. She just ruined everything.
It wasn't all for naught when it came down to it, though, for old Crassus, as he was elected to the office of consul the following year, like he had hoped for, serving right alongside his good buddy Pompey. Crassus would again win the consulship 15 years later in 55 BC, again right alongside Pompey. However, despite his bitterness over the mounting grievances over the years, the two would come together to back this young populist on the rise named Julius Caesar. and together they formed what was known to history as the First Triumvirate, which we see a nod to in the last episode. Together, the three pretty much dominated Roman politics for the next several years, and as part of their dividing up the Republic, Crassus was given governance of Syria and anything lying east that he could add to his collection. This awarded him the opportunity to get even richer than he already was, since the eastern provinces were far and away the most profitable. But it also afforded him lands that he could conquer and finally get that triumph that had eluded him his whole career. The lands he chose to make his conquest was the Kingdom of Parthia in modern-day Iran, and it was pretty much publicly known that his intention was to instigate an unprovoked war for nothing but his own benefits, and so in protest of this, on the day Crassus was set to leave for Syria, an angry crowd tried to block him from exiting the city. It got so bad that eventually it would be Pompey who showed up and calmed the group enough that Crassus could exit the city, and honestly, Pompey might go down as one of the greatest trolls of the ancient world at this point because it's all genuinely hilarious to me. Anyway, the campaign started off relatively well, but if Crassus thought he was just going to go in there and steamroll the Parthians, which we know he kinda did because he refused assistance from the King of Armenia, who was a Roman ally, and his 46,000 extra troops, well, he was incredibly mistaken, and he underestimated the shit out of them, which sealed his fate. He would be accompanied on this quest by his son Publius, and I know Tiberius and him are not supposed to be the same person, as in the show Tiberius runs his way into the trapment for his father, and is killed during the prisoner exchange by Crassus's body slave whom he assaulted. But for the sake of the remainder of this tale, just pretend that Tiberius is Publius because it just makes it way better. So Crassus, for all intents and purposes, completely ignores advice from anyone close to him and advances deep into the desert in pursuit of the Parthians, and once they are spotted, he deploys in an unusual square formation rather than the classic Roman line in order to avoid being flanked by his enemy, whom he thought had the superior number of cavalry. This turned out to be a massive mistake though, as his troops were soon completely enveloped on all sides by the Parthian troops, who proceeded to unload tens of thousands of arrows and projectiles at the Romans from what seemed like an infinite supply. Attempts to drive them off would be thwarted back by the sheer number of arrows coming at them, and eventually it got to the point where Crassus felt he had no choice but to send his cavalry commander with the rest of his mounted troops and one of the legions to try and break through the line and either create a pocket for the remainder to escape and regroup, or to get reinforcements of some kind, his cavalry commander being his son Publius. To everyone's relief though, Publius and his men broke through, chasing off one of the lines of Parthians, and Crassus watched as his son pursued them away while he maintained defensive position. What he didn't know was that after a short distance, his son and his men were also encircled and completely outmatched, with Publius himself suffering a horrible injury. Afraid of what might happen to him if he were captured, Publius ordered his men to kill him, which they obliged before they too were killed. The next time Crassus saw his son was a short time later, when a Parthian rider began riding back and forth in front of the Roman square, flaunting a spear with Publius's severed head at the end of it. Seeing his son meet such a grisly fate, and now understanding the gravity of the situation they were in, completely broke Crassus, as we're told he spent hours into the night just huddled on the floor grieving. Some of his men assumed command and decided to lead the remainder of the men during the night to the nearby city of Carrhae, where they figured they might be safe. When the Parthians figured out, they descended on the city and gave the remaining Romans a chance to go back where they came from, so long as Crassus himself would negotiate a peace treaty. He had absolutely no interest in doing this though, since he was still reeling from the day before, but his men essentially mutinied and forced him to do so. However, during what we're told was a very odd exchange with the Parthians, a fight breaks out and Crassus would have his hand and then his head cut off. Then they melted some gold down, and as a way to mock his enormous wealth, poured it down the mouth of the severed head. The Parthian general then selected one of the captured Roman prisoners and told him that henceforth he would be known as Crassus. He then dressed him as a woman and took him on tour across the Parthian kingdom, calling it Crassus's Triumph. So I guess he finally got his grand parade, just not at all how I'm sure he expected. Again, Macho Man Randy levels of savage. Oh, and as an extra fuck you on top of the whole thing, with Crassus's death, it basically now made the new richest man in Rome, you guessed it, Pompey. However, his death also was a falling domino that eventually sent things on the path to yet another Roman civil war and would change the course of history. But that's another story for maybe another time. After the Third Servile War was won, the Roman state wisely began assuming much more control of the public games, and many gladiators began to be trained in large imperial schools, but they also limited the number of gladiators that could be in the city of Rome at any one time. Over the next 100 years, we would get laws that gave slaves in general some sort of protection and progress, such as the banning of killing of one's slaves without just cause, or granting freedom to any slave whose master had abandoned them. We can't give a definitive cause and effect relationship from the rebellion as it pertains to this, because the reforms came so much later, but what we can say is that at least culturally, this is when Romans began shifting to view their slaves as more respected property, as laughable as that sounds. There would never be another major slave revolt like that of the Thracian legend and his army of gladiators, but for a couple of years, there was a beacon of hope for those in servitude, while Spartacus and his chosen brothers and sisters waged war across the Republic. And when I really think about it, there's only one true way to honor this tale of camaraderie. While at the end of the day Spartacus ultimately failed at leading his rebellion to victory, Rome absolutely never forgot him, and his legend echoed across time all the way to our modern day, where he has sports teams, political parties, and entire villages named after him in his honor. And if his primary goal was his own freedom, well, he did die a free man that history remembers, so in that way, did he really lose? He has been the chosen rallying symbol for many who would seek freedom from injustice, and his story has been told many times in popular culture over the years, which I suspect will never stop because Spartacus will always be relevant as his tale transcends languages, genders, or race. It speaks to the inner rebel and badass everyone is capable of when someone tries to dictate their way of living or take away their freedoms.
I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus!
You know what I'm talking about.
Because I'm a stud. I'm ballsy. I don't take no shit from anyone.
As for my overall review of the show, I am pleased to say that I have been left with an even bigger appreciation for it than what I already had. The things I already knew were great, like the performances, the sets, and the action have retained their luster with a certain timelessness, but it's the writing that I'm now able to understand so much more of, and the amount of care that went into it is really put on display, which in turn just amps up my anticipation for the spin-off even more. And when you know that it's executed with all that in mind, even the inaccuracies can feel like they have a place in the tale, and all in all, it feels really good to revisit. Like, really good. It tickles the old nerd boner. By the gods, it almost makes me wanna... Okay, it's funny again. And there you have it, beautiful people. A legend told and a promise fulfilled. What did you think? Tell me about it down in the comments and let me know what movie you'd like the real story on, and maybe I will add it to the never-ending list of possibilities. Also, if you enjoyed, please do the things to the button so you won't miss what's next. And there is the Patreon if you want to help financially. That would be nice.
I'm really stepping up my game. These bitches gotta start paying me for this. Can't get no more free, Randy.
Anyway, y'all, thanks for watching as always, and I will see you on another time.